What's up, Padlords? It's your gun, Lightwater here, coming at you with another video. And we're going to continue with the How to Theorycraft series, and this will be part 2. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, sorry about that. So, we are going to go over how to do, essentially how we're going to do talents. Now this will be very complicated, so I don't expect you guys to get this on the first try. And it took me many years, honestly, to master this. But essentially, you want to figure out how much each row is going to do for you, HPS or DPS wise. This is a very slow process, and you're going to need the work that you did from part 1. Okay, so if we whip that sheet out, you're going to need this one right here. And you need all the proper values, all the proper mana cost, the cooldown, everything. So you have this off to the side. So I'll have this on my left screen over here. And so you go line for line. Now, what you want to do is you want to essentially create an alternate version of all of your spells, because these talents are going to modify all of your spells, right? So obviously after abundance is in place, your average regrowth will be severely different, because it's pretty much assumed that when you use abundance, you're going to be spamming rejuves and then regrowths. The question is, how many rejuves will you have out, and how many stacks of abundance will be modifying regrowth? This is something that you have to really think about and figure out for yourself. For me, I took the duration of rejuve, I took the average amount of haste, found out the cast time, or rather the global time for rejuve and the cast time for regrowth, and I asked myself, how many could I spam in a 15-second period, which is the duration of rejuve? And it came out to something like 6 of them each, right? Because, you know, they basically take 1.5 seconds to cast, but, you know, without any haste. So if you have average haste of 10-15%, you could get about 6 rejuves up. So that's 6 stacks of abundance. So you know that each stack of abundance is 6%. 6 times 6 is 36. So what we would do is we would create an alternate version of regrowth that has its mana cost reduced by 36 and its critical strike chance increased by 36, aka its healing increased by 36%. So you would put that down in the timeline below. Alright, so there would be a regrowth down here, many lines down below, like this. And you would put plus A for like abundance, right? Plus A. Actually, we'll put plus A6, right? For 6 stacks of abundance. And we'd obviously math all of that out. Now, if you went prosperity, we know that Swiftman would essentially have an additional charge, and its cooldown would be reduced by 3 seconds. So you would put that in there. And then Scenario and Award. Now we know its base is not reduced by, hasn't been divided by 5%, so you have to do that. And essentially, you go through, and then you'd ask yourself, which one so far is an HPS increase, right? Now, how would you find out the HPS increase on these 2 spells here? Because essentially this is just giving you more Swiftmans in a fight. What you would do, and I know it sounds crazy, but essentially with Swiftman has a 25-second cooldown. So this would drop its 25-second cooldown to 22 seconds, essentially giving you them 3 seconds faster. So you could divide 360, which is a 6-minute fight, which is what you want to base all your theory crafting off of. I divided 360 by 25, and then I got a number, and then I divided 360 by 22, and I got a number. The number that was 22, I added 1 more Swiftmend, which is the additional charge, and then I looked at the difference, and I said, how many more Swiftmends am I getting with this talent in a 6-minute fight, assuming I cast it on cooldown? And then I look at the efficiency of Swiftman, and I compare that to what my typical filler would be, which is going to be a rejuve or a regrowth. So you compare it to those, and you ask yourself, how much better is it? And that's basically it, guys. I mean, it's difficult to put a percentage on it, but you'll have to memorize those numbers, and you can figure out the percent later. Essentially, because we have all of the mana cost of all of the spells, by the time we're done picking all of our talents, we could theoretically create a sim, right? So if it comes down to it and we figure out we're going to take abundance and we're taking, you know, like this is the current build I run right now, for almost any setting. this is what I'm running right here. Okay, so cultivation works well with rejuves. I obviously have spring blossom, so I keep mushroom down 24/7. Photosynthesis, so I try to keep life and money to the tanker myself 24/7. And abundance, which means I'm spamming rejuves and then regrowths. Because I know this is the rotation, I can expect that I'm gonna have a life up 24/7, mushroom down 24/7, and then spam as many rejuves and regrowths as possible after that. So the mana that I don't spend on the mushroom, plus the life bloom, plus the tranks, plus the swiftmans, plus all the other and more efficient things, you take all that mana, you add it up, and then you subtract it from the mana that you have in a fight. Okay, and for those of you guys that don't know, you have 400% of your mana in a 6-minute fight. Essentially, you have 3 mana pools worth of regeneration, and then 1 mana pool, which is the original mana pool you started with. And that's all you have to work with, 400% mana. So if you guys are ever wondering how to value a mana trinket or some kind of mana return, you essentially take how much mana it gave you and you divide it by 4. So for example, let's say you used a potion and it gave you back 10k mana. You used that cheap little potion. 10k, or rather 10 divided by 4 is 2.5. So a mana potion, the regular one, is a 2.5% HPS increase. Obviously this is crude math and it's not exactly scientific, but I don't exactly see a better way to really theorycraft this stuff. You could get really nitty gritty with it, right? So you could ask yourself is, what does the extra mana get spent on? Obviously it's your filler. What percent of your healing is your filler versus the percent of mana it used? You can actually math it out, guys. It's pretty insane. But typically I like to keep things a little bit more simple than that, just so people can understand. Whew, this is going to be a long video. I pray that you guys understand. Okay. So, for Cenarian Award, what we would do, first of all, we need to find the true mana cost of this, right? And I realize that a lot of you guys aren't going to be druids, so bear with me. I try to apply this to your other spells. But whenever there's a spell in a talent tree, we want to figure out how much better it is, right? Now, this has a cooldown, so it won't be a filler spell. So it's competing with other spells like Swiftmen and stuff, right? So 9.2. Now remember, this is a hybrid class, so we have to divide its mana cost by 5. So there's its true mana cost, 1.84. Okay. Now remember, the core passive is not factored in, which is plus 44% damage, or sorry, healing, rather. So 220 needs to get increased by 44%. Plus 44%. Boom. That's its actual healing. That's its actual mana cost. We divide it by the mana cost, 1.84, and it has 172 efficiency. Now this is nearly double the efficiency of a rejuve, or basically a rejuve. Regrowth's around like 150, right? So we know that if it's just Scenario Award by itself without any mastery, it's not probably going to be very good. So the question is, how many masteries would it need to be competitive? If you have 20% mastery and you stack this with maybe 4 other hots, it's not bad. It would increase it by 80%, right? So we could go like this, plus 80%. And now it's at 309 efficiency. Basically triple the efficiency of a rejuve. So it's not bad. This is essentially what you would do is you would compare this alongside a rejuve, and you would say if you took 3 rejuves, right? Because basically this is the healing. It's hard to explain, but now that you know how much more efficient it is, like it's worth basically 3 rejuves for the price of 1. You can find out how many rejuves you cast in a fight. You could divide the number by you could divide it by 3 and find out how much 3 rejuves do worth of your healing, and that would be kind of the percent HPS increase of Scenario Award. Or you do a test run, obviously with Scenario Award, and you see what percentage of your healing it is. You try to make it the best you can. You give it lots of hots, and you look at the percent it did. If it did really well, then you can kind of get a good grasp of how much HPS it's actually increasing. But remember, you have to take into account that you're not going to have abundance or prosperity. I realize now this is very difficult to explain, but essentially There's certain talents that we can mathematically say are better. There's other talents that take testing. This is a row where we know abundance is very good, but you would have to test the Narnia award. Now, prosperity is an easier one to figure out because this just means more Swiftmen, so we can figure out the exact number of extra Swiftmens in a fight, and then you can determine if that's worth it. But obviously we want to math it out. So what you would do is you do a test run without prosperity. You'd find out what it's like to have Swiftmens at 25 seconds. Then you'd have to ask yourself, well, how many more Swiftmens would have gone with the 22-second cooldown and the extra charge? Right. So let's say, for example, you got off 20 Swiftmens. I know that's pretty ridiculous. I guess we'll make it more realistic. But let's say you get 13 Swiftmens off. Okay. And let's say it did 5% of your healing. Okay. Now with this talent, let's say you could have gotten off 3 more. Maybe you could have gotten off 16 Swiftmens. So you divide the 5% by 13 to find out what percent per Swiftmen you average. Then you times it by the additional number of Swiftmens that you would have gotten. So let's take our example. We said it was 5%. 5% divided by 13 is 0.38% of your healing per Swiftman. If this gives you 3 more Swiftmens, we could say times 3. Boom, it's a 1.15% HBS increase, assuming that Swiftmend is only 5% of your healing. And if it's 10% of your healing, you would just double this number. All in all, prosperity is not that great. It's pretty much only used for Mythic Plus, and even then it's kind of meh. Now, we haven't factored in other talents like Soul of the Forest and stuff like that, but you can kind of get a good gauge of it right off the bat. This one doesn't matter. Not really. Doesn't matter. Okay, so 75. Now, with Soul of the Forest. When you cast Swiftmend, you gain Soul of the Forest, increasing the healing of your next regrowth or rejuve by 200%, or the healing of your next wall growth by 75%. What this basically is saying is every time you cast Swiftmend, it's as if you get 2 more regrowths or 2 more rejuves, because it's saying you increase it by 200%. Which would turn, a spell that's 100 into 300. It's basically 3 times. Or increases the healing of your next wall growth by 75%. So, first of all, what would we want to use this on? Well, we would go to our chart over here. Okay. So we know wild growth heals for this much, right? 378. And we know that regrowth heals for this much, 150. So we'd ask ourselves, and also here's rejuve, 129.6. So we ask ourselves, what's better? Well, first of all, we know that it would be better to use it on regrowth, so rejuve's out already. So it's regrowth versus a wild growth. So 2 times the regrowth number would be a 300 more increase versus 75% of wild growth. So let's find out what 75% of 378 is. 378 times 0.75. 283. Now remember, 283 had to compete against 2 times your regrowth healing. And that was 300. So the regrowth healing wins out. So if you did take Soul of the Forest, you would use it on regrowth. Okay? So now we ask ourselves, how much is 200 more coefficient every 25 seconds worth it? And if we had prosperity, it would obviously be 22 seconds. Well, we have to compare these to cultivation. So, when rejuve heals a target below 60% health, it applies cultivation to target, healing them for 20% spell power over 6 seconds. Now, I believe this number is not increased by the 44%, so it would be somewhere around like 30%. 30% over 6 seconds. Now, rejuve does last 15 seconds. So, how did you figure this out? Well, we would do the same thing that we did in the first video, right? We know that rejuve heals every 3 seconds. And so, essentially, you would break cultivation down into 2 parts. So, if it did 30% over 6 seconds, that's 15% over 3. We know that 3 goes into 15 5 times, so essentially you would get 2.5 cultivations, right? Because cultivation lasts 6 seconds. So 6, another cultivation would be 12 seconds. Half of a cultivation is 15. That's basically 5 ticks of 15%. So we know that cultivation over the duration of rejuve would heal for 75. I guess it's kind of confusing because I just did all the math in my head. But you sort of get the point, right? You have to figure out how much healing the cultivation will do during the rejuve. Then you have to ask yourself, how likely is this going to happen? You don't get to just add this in automatically, right? How often is somebody below 60%? And I did a test with and without it, and I found that if I was going to use this talent, I basically can only rejuve people that are below 60%. And I'm okay with that because the class has mana problems anyways. So I have to be really choosy with who I heal. The difference being was insane though. Essentially, if you have 20% mastery, this is just another haunt that you didn't have access to before. The heal is not necessarily why you would bring it. It's the percent increased healing on the rest of your stuff. So it's pretty hard to beat an additional haunt, considering that's what your class is pretty much based around. So it's pretty much an auto win, right? If everything has cultivation, and I have 20% mastery, that's 20% alone from the mastery. And if cultivation does like 5% of my healing, whatever, that's a bonus, right? I mean, the talent's essentially like a 25% increase, assuming they always have cultivation. Now, Tree of Life, how would you figure out what this is worth? So it's the 3-minute cooldown, 30-second duration. Shapeshifts in the Tree of Life, increasing healing done by 15%, increasing armor by 120, and granting protection. Okay. It changes the functionality. So for Wild Growth, it adds 2 more targets healed. So from 5 to 7, essentially a 40% increase to Wild Growth healing. Regrowth makes it instant. Doesn't add any healing, unfortunately. For Rejuve, it makes it cheaper by 33%, I think. And it makes it heal 50% more. Or maybe I got those backwards. Let me see. Okay, so it, yeah, increases the healing by 50%. And the mana cost is reduced by 30%. So, obviously, you would spam only rejuves in tree form. It's just the way to go. Once you're done spamming rejuves out of tree form, then you could do lots of regrowths because they'll basically be free and crit if you take abundance. A lot of people don't take abundance with tree, though. They usually take Cenarian Ward. But yeah, a lot of people make the mistake of spamming regrowths in Tree of Life form. Unless you have a lot of abundance stacks built up from a lot of rejuves, I wouldn't suggest that. Because nothing is increased except for the fact that you can cast while moving. Whereas the efficiency of rejuve is like more than doubled, right? So the healing is increased by 50%, the mana cost is reduced by 30. It's basically doubles the efficiency of the spell. It's really nice. Wild Growth actually becomes somewhat decent. But Wild Growth's efficiency was never really that good to begin with. You would know if you did all the math, right? So remember, you always can reference this. You see how poorly efficient Wild Growth is compared to like a Rejuve or a Regrowth, right? Now, obviously, this Regrowth has nothing added. So I guess in reality, we should be using this sheet because this actually has updated numbers. So you can see a Regrowth with your average abundance stacks and with mastery factored in, 163 efficiency. Wild Growth with just this one mastery factored in, 75. And because here's the thing, Wild Growth heals a lot, but it costs 6% of your mana. That's where they get you. And I guess you essentially would just keep going line per line, and you have to take each one of these like a math problem. It's going to be very difficult. For stuff like Inner Peace, this is essentially like a 50% increase to the Tranks. What I thought this was, essentially, take whatever you normally get with Trank healing, and then think what is 50% of that, and that's about how much this would increase your healing by. Basically, this is going to increase your number of Tranks from 2 to 3 per fight. Right? So let's say your Tranquility healing is 10%. If you took Inner Peace, you could assume it'd be 15%. Because each Trank's doing 5% of your healing, stands the reason that the third Trank would do 5%. Obviously, this is not taking into account why you'd actually want another Trank, which is for a raid cooldown. This is purely from a raw HPS standpoint, okay? But sometimes that's how you have to heal things. Stonebark, this is an interesting one. This reduces the cooldown of Ironbark from 1 minute to 45 and increases the healing of your heal over time effects on the target by 20%. This one's pretty solid. Actually, the fact that I haven't taken this for 5-mans yet, just to try it out, I feel like it's pretty bad because I feel like this is meant for 5-mans. However, this is actually not that bad. The big kicker is the 20% increased healing. this essentially functions as another mastery stack for everybody you're healing. However, you can't really fight the real deal, which is Spring Blossoms. So this is it basically gives everybody that your mushroom heals a hot for 6 seconds. It doesn't require them to be at a certain percentage of life, right? So by default, you have to factor in your mastery. If you have 20% mastery like I do, so automatically 20% increased healing on everybody who's healed. Not to mention, obviously, the hot on all the people is nice too. And then you'd have to compete, right? It's pretty hard to beat a 20% on basically half the raid, because about half the raid is going to be stacking your mushroom. Now, if it's a fight where people aren't stacking it as well, like Mithrax, for example, you can only really stack in the phases that aren't where everybody has to spread out. So it gets some diminished return. I would say Spring Blossoms is about only maybe a third of the raid average standing in it. And so you kind of have to go through each fight and ask yourself, what percentage of this is going to be on the raid members, and then you take that and times it by your mastery. So for example, say you really only think your mushroom's going to be on about a third of the raid. You would times 0.3 by your mastery. So if you have 20 mastery, you know what this is only really, or 20% mastery, you know this is only really going to increase your healing by 6%, which is still pretty good, honestly. You have to really fuck up the mushroom for Spring Blossoms not to be worth it. It's just simply so good and increases your healing so much on those people that actually need it. Okay. Last row, this stuff gets real wonky. Essentially, for cool... Let me see if I can find something that's a little different here. So for a thing like Flourish, okay. So Flourish was a difficult cooldown of Theorcraft because it extends the duration of all your active hots, which means it has a varying level of success based on what the lead up to it was, and also increases your heal over time effects, only your heal over time effects, by 100% for 8 seconds. So what does that mean? It means that you really want to pre-hot before this, obviously. But you have to ask yourself, 8 seconds of your heal over time effects, probably going to be just rejuves, my guess, unless of course you are rocking cultivation with this, which you absolutely could be. My original build with Flourish was that you'd spam a bunch of rejuves into a wild growth, into an instant Flourish, so at least a Flourish, increase the wild growth. Cool thing about Flourish and wild growth, something most people maybe don't know. So wild growth's duration is very short. It's 7 seconds. So if you were to increase a duration of 7 seconds by 8 seconds, what does that mean? Well, it basically more than doubles the spell. Not to mention, you also increase your healing by 100% while it's active for 8 seconds, which is, again, would be the first portion of wild growth healing. So it's a bit complicated, right? So you take a wild growth at 100%. You then increase it by double. So now another 100%. Okay. For the first 100%, you double the healing on it because you increase the rate. So that's 200%, 100%. So you've essentially tripled the healing of wild growth. And so you'd have to factor in the efficiency of a triple. Is it even worth casting a wild growth that does triple? So we look at our little chart here. And we look at wild growth. If you triple it, this becomes 186. Obviously, this is not properly updated one. Let's look at the 1.2. So a wild growth that's been tripled is, let's see, 150, 225. So 225 is clearly worth it. It beats out regrowth and rejuve and even swiftmint. Now, obviously, the rejuves would be increased as well. And so what you would do is, depending on how much time is left with the rejuve, let's assume you add, okay, so it adds 8 seconds and then increases that 8 seconds by 100%. So 8 seconds of rejuve. So you'd basically take 15. Or rather, you take 8 divided by 15, I think, right? Let me see. So what portion of 15 is 8? 8 divided by 15. Okay, so we know it's 53%. So it's 53% of the duration of a rejuve, and then you add 100%, right? So you essentially would times this by 2. So you could take 1.06% of a rejuve. Now we know the rejuve, it would heal this much, right? So let's take the first number because the other number is with some other bullshit. So you take this and you times this by the value to you would take, you would not times it. Actually, you would 203. Okay, so here's how much the portion of germination would do for that rejuve. 216 divided by the mana cost. 2. Sorry, well, actually it's 2.1, but you get the idea. And essentially, that adds an additional 100 to the efficiency of it while you're flourished, bringing it to 200. Now remember, the efficiency of Walga tripled, bringing it to 225. So it would beat out Rejuve, so it is worth casting. That's a lot of math. I feel like I'm not quite getting this across properly, and this is something that will take maybe many episodes to try to teach people how to do. I might have to go a case-by-case basis, but essentially, guys, you'd want to go through, you know, depending on the class, if you're a Holy Paladin, you go through each row, and you really try to ask yourself, you try to boil it down, right? So it has a mana cost, an uptime, a percent increase, something you can theory craft. And I would challenge you guys to check your math multiple times. Always assume you got it wrong. For example, Divine Purpose was a very tricky one to theory craft, because it essentially gives your stuff a 20% chance to not use its cooldown and the next cast be free. So this was very tricky to figure out, because essentially you do have to pay another global to cast it again, which means that the original one doesn't go on cooldown right away. And because with a lot of haste, the cooldown can be quite short, this can be a very difficult equation, because you then have to figure out what the global cast time of the spell in the first place is, then subtract that from the cooldown. If you actually want to get the most accurate data, you kind of have to do that. And then you ask yourself, how many additional Light of Dawns and Holy Shocks will I get in a fight? Well, the obvious answer is 20%. It's not necessarily the right answer, though. You may not get 20% extra. Again, it takes another global to cast this before the spell actually goes on cooldown. So maybe it's something more along the lines of 15% more or something. Now, the beautiful part about this is it's free, so it doesn't cost mana. So you don't have to worry about any efficiencies. And that's good. But it gets real wonky when you start mixing in things like Awakening. Now, all of a sudden, this spell that has a 20% chance to redo its cooldown can proc a Light of Dawn, or Avenging, give you an Avenging Wrath for 10 seconds, right? So now that makes it more interesting, because that essentially means that each Light of Dawn is worth 1.5 seconds of Avenging Wrath, right? 15% of 10 is 1.5. So then you would factor that into its equation of how much it's worth it, and it just gets more and more wonky as you continue on when you factor in Crusader's Might. This stuff is very difficult to theory craft, and I don't really expect you guys to be able to figure it out, and I'm not quite sure if I can teach you ways to just universally theory craft everything, but the only way you can learn is trial and error. So hopefully I've given you the tools. Hopefully you can stumble through it. You can always message me and ask me questions. I've done all the theory crafting on all the healers. And I want this to be a guide that not just healers, but DPS and maybe hopefully down the line tanks can use. Essentially, you have a goal. What's the goal? Highest DPS, highest tankiness, highest healing. Okay, that's the goal. Then you try to achieve that goal through your talents, and you attempt to get an answer. The key is we get an answer, right? Maybe it's not right, but at least you tried. And the answer is, what's the percent increased HPS? What's the percent increased DPS? And you just keep doing the math over and over and over and over until you find the right answer. And for people who say that it isn't possible to boil every talent down to a percent increased HPS, I beg to differ. Maybe it's complicated and it's very difficult, but it can be done. And that's what needs to be done if you want to be rank 1. That's what I do. That's how I invented this build right here. Nobody uses this build. I guess technically it's this right here. Yeah. This build's still not being used today, and I know hands down it's the best paladin build out there for raid healing. Especially once you get 25% haste. You have like a 40% uptime on wings. It's just madness. It's insane. It's outperforming all of the Holy Paladin builds currently. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to play my Holy Paladin in raid, and because of how unfriendly it is for melee in this expansion, it's just not viable in our raid comp. So, but yeah, man, I feel like I'm rambling at this point. I just feel like I'm sending a bunch of you poor little guppies out into the world with such little information. Yeah, feel free to ask as many questions in the comment section as you guys want. I'll try to answer them all, even if they're DPS related ones. You know, I can. Here's the beautiful thing, right? Even though I do all my theory crafting for healers, there's no reason why I can't apply the same system to DPS and do the same thing. We can go down every spell, figure out their coefficients. Then we can go line by line by line and figure out what it means, right? What does it mean for a patchwork fight? What does it mean for an AoE fight? So, there it is, guys. I'm going to call the video here. Thanks for watching. This has been Lightwater, and let's make theory crafting great again. No, let's make healing great again. Haha, almost messed that one up. Yeah, thanks for watching, guys.